Hello everyone, it's David from Automotive Press. Some of you guys might be asking exactly what makes sports car a true sports car. Well, that's a very interesting question that could have multiple answers. But what I want to do today is to answer that question from an engineer's perspective. So that means from my perspective, what does a real sports car really supposed to do? And I'm going to use this car as a reference point, which is a Mercedes-Benz SL63. It's a perfect car to talk about because this is almost a perfect sports car. I say almost because I also want to compare this to the likes of Porsche 911 Turbo and also the old-time favorite that many of you guys like, which is a Lexus LC 500. So I'm going to talk about all three cars at the same time and talk about what defines a really great sports car. Let's go. Welcome back. So right now I'm inside the Mercedes-Benz SL63, which is one of the flagship sports car you can buy, and this is all new and this is a beautiful vehicle. But I'm going to come back to the question that I asked earlier, which is what actually defines something as a true sports car, as a great sports car, not just a good sports car. Well, the first point I want to talk about is the handling, perhaps the most misunderstood term in the business of automobile. So when it comes to handling, I define it as how quickly the car or vehicle responds to the input from my hand. So as I turn the steering left or right around twisty corners and roads, how quickly does the car actually follow the direction of the steering? Slower the response, the less agile the car is, and therefore the handling wouldn't be as good. And conversely, if I move the steering quickly and the car can turn quickly and tracks straight to where I'm pointed, well, that defines a good handling. But here's the problem. If the steering is so quick that it literally follows my steering input immediately, then it's also a little bit jittery and difficult to drive on the highway, because as you pick up the speed, if the steering response is too fast and too quick and too sensitive, then as you're making a little bit of minor changes to the steering, the car will dart left and right. And therefore, car companies always struggle to balance the difference between having quick steering, which will make it more fun to drive, but if it's too quick, then it's a little bit difficult to drive straight and comfortably on a highway speed. And that balance is always a very difficult one. Obviously, as an engineer who loves to drive cars, I prefer a faster steering, a more responsive steering, but at the same time, I do drive long distances on the highway as well. So it cannot be so quick and so fast that it's just difficult to drive. An example would be many of the Alfa Romeo cars, which have a really good handling and a very sharp handling as well. But because the steering is so quick and so sensitive, they tend to be a little bit more difficult to drive on the highway. So that's the first thing I want to point out, is that a great sports car have to have a quick steering, which translates to great handling, but not so fast that it is difficult to drive on the highway speed. And in terms of coming back to the Mercedes SL63 compared to Porsche 911 or 911 Turbo, and also compared to Lexus LC 500, what I can tell you is that among, let's say, those three vehicles specifically, the 911 probably have the best handling, in the sense that it has a very quick, accurate steering and handling, but at the same time, it is quite manageable and quite comfortable on the highway. Second place, right after 911 and not too far off, is this Mercedes SL63, which has a good road feel, but also very accurate steering, but not quite as accurate as the Porsche 911, because this one's a little bit more toward a grand touring sports car, and therefore it is more enjoyable to drive on highway speed as well. The third and the last one in terms of the handling is a Lexus LC 500, which might surprise you, but that one is clearly geared for more of a grand touring experience, and therefore the steering is a little bit less accurate, not as quick, and handling not quite as sharp as the Mercedes SL63 or the Porsche 911. The second thing I want to point out is very closely related to the first one, but not exactly the same, and that is the actual steering feel. I'm not talking about the handling, so I'm not talking about the ability for a car to quickly track straight or to turn quickly based on the steering input, but what I'm talking about is what you feel in your hands as you drive. Is the steering heavy, light? Can I actually feel the road? Is there actual feedback and a communication between the road and my hands? And that is perhaps the most difficult things to do these days, because almost all cars uses electric power steering or EPS versus the old-fashioned hydraulic power steering. In the old days, with the hydraulic power steering, as the hydraulic pressure built up, you can actually feel it in your hand, because mechanically we're kind of connected to the road. And therefore, old cars with the hydraulic power steering, or some new cars like the Lotus Emira with the hydraulic power steering, have a great steering feel that just cannot be replicated with today's modern electric power steering. Because what they have to do today is, due to the fact that there's no more hydraulic pressure buildup, they have to build in a feel of the road into the electric power steering using software and calibration and try to mimic that feel. And that's obviously very difficult to do because it's a software dependent calibration versus hardware dependent feel. And so many cars just do not get that right. And you know that this is one of my pet peeves because so many cars have a numb steering that is too light, making it easy to drive perhaps and easy to park, but absolutely boring to drive. So coming back to the Mercedes SL63 compared to Porsche 911 and also Lexus LC, here's my take on it. I think the 911 still has the best steering feel. It has a steering feel that is very close to the hydraulic power steering, partly because their steering mechanism and the system is a little bit different from other companies, but also they just know how to tune it better. But very closely behind is the Mercedes SL63. I would say that it's almost there, not quite as communicative as a 911, but you know what? This is probably as close as you can get outside the Porsche family. So I would say the SL63 has a really good steering feel and it's not too light, which is something I really don't like. This one just have the right amount of weight. Now let's compare that to the Lexus LC as well. And perhaps that's the weakest point about the Lexus LC 500 because that one has a kind of numb steering and it doesn't feel very connected to the road. So even though I love that car and one of these days I'm going to buy it somehow, maybe a used one, I do admit the steering feel in terms of the weight, in terms of the communication between the road and my hand isn't very ideal. So from that perspective, among the Grand Touring sports car, not the pure sports car like 911, this one probably has the best steering feel and I can drive this thing all day because of such a great steering feel. So far I talked about the handling and the steering feel as two important criteria. But the third one is perhaps the most important of all, and that is to do with the engine. How does the engine feel? How does it perform? And what does it actually output in terms of power and torque? But I will tell you that in order to have a great sports car, it can't just be the engine itself. The steering and handling have to be also really good. That's very important to me anyways. But coming back to this car for a moment, this SL63 has whopping 577 horsepower and 590 pound-foot of torque. So it's got great amount of torque, but more importantly, because it's a V8 and also turbocharged at the same time, it achieves maximum torque at a very low RPM. And that is one huge benefit and advantage of this particular AMG engine because of the fact that when you step on the gas, you're going to feel great amount of torque right away compared to non-turbocharged engine. So where am I going with this? Well, in order to have a great sports car, you can't just have a high amount of horsepower. I prefer to have more torque at lower RPM than simply to have huge amount of horsepower. And therefore, there is a definitely advantage for cars like this particular SL63 or Porsche 911, just because they have a turbocharged system that allows them to achieve much higher torque at lower RPM. And you're going to notice that when you step on the gas. This particular engine, by the way, is handcrafted by AMG. It has perhaps one of the best feel in terms of engine. But now you're going to probably ask me, which of these engines do I prefer? The Porsche 911 turbo engine, this AMG SL63 engine, or the Lexus LC 500? Well, in terms of a definition of a great sports car, which talks about the power and torque and how fast these power and torque are peaked, I'm going to have to admit that Porsche 911 Turbo and this one, the SL63, comes pretty close, and they are definitely more fun to drive than the Lexus LC 500. And therefore, based on my definition of a great sports car, the 911 Turbo and the SL63 would be considered a better sports car than Lexus LC 500. But sometimes the numbers don't tell the whole story because the Lexus LC 500's naturally aspirated 5-liter V8 engine has such an amazing feel and amazing sound that even though it doesn't achieve the same amount of torque at lower RPM, for me it is actually a more entertaining car. So that's where things get a little bit more complicated because the definition of a great sports car do refer to the performance, power and torque, and perhaps 0 to 60 as well. But sometimes when you're driving a car, the numbers don't matter too much because ultimately the car have to talk to you. And from that perspective, I really like the Lexus LC 500 because that naturally aspirated V8 engine is unlike anything else out there. And you know what, for everyday driving, I really like that engine, and maybe even more so compared to the SL63 or the Porsche 911. The fourth point I want to talk about in terms of defining a great sports car is the suspension setup. And I don't just mean super hard suspension that can corner like a racing car, that isn't the definition of a great sports car. From my perspective, a really good sports car have to balance out good and decent ride with ability to corner well and stay flat. And that might require some electronic dampening in some cases, because by using a computer and electronic system to adjust either the shocks or the spring rate themselves, it can actually really help with that. But coming back to my definition of a great sports car in terms of ride, it has to be flat around the corners and very steady, but at the same time, it cannot be so firm that it's almost impossible to ride on a daily basis. And that, once again, is a very difficult balance to achieve, because what most sports car companies do is simply to increase the rate for springs and shocks and make it super stiff. That will automatically give you a flatter ride, a more firm ride, and therefore a feeling of a better sports car. But that isn't the case if it's simply a hard suspension. And to achieve that kind of balance, you have to play around with the calibration between the shocks, the springs, and if there's electronic dampening, then you have to also adjust the electronic dampening calibration as well. So all of that will play into creating a perfect ride. So in coming back to these three cars I've been talking about, 911, SL63, and Lexus LC 500, where do things fitting? Well, in this case, I think the SL63 comes to the very top. This has a very firm, very steady ride that allows the car to corner like crazy, but it is surprising and shockingly comfortable even over rough roads and a bumpy road. I tried to drive this over some of the more difficult terrains, and it handles that with ease. The 911 Turbo and all 911s in general is a little bit firmer for my taste, and they're great sports car obviously, but they can be a little bit jarring when you're driving over bumpy city roads. And then Lexus LC 500 is perhaps a little bit too soft for my taste, because they're really gearing that toward a Grand Touring sports car. So comparing these three vehicles, I think the SL63 comes to the very top in terms of giving you that perfect balance of the ride. The next point I want to talk about is the transmission, and this one is a little bit more difficult to define because everyone has a different taste for transmission. Obviously, many of us prefer manual transmission versus automatic, but there's not too many high-performing sports car with the manual transmissions anymore. So for now, I'm going to just talk about the automatic transmission. In the case of SL63, we have a 9-speed automatic transmission. It's a very fast-shifting, smooth-shifting transmission that complements well with a bi-turbo V8 engine. But from my definition, the best sports car have a transmission that shifts ever so slightly, but it's not so smooth that you don't feel the shift. I actually don't want a transmission that is so seamless that as you're stepping through gears, you can't even tell it's shifting. That's for family cars. For sports car, I want to feel a little bit of the shifting and also be able to shift manually using the paddle shifter. That perhaps is one of the most important attributes for a sports car. And when I use the paddle shifter to shift the gear up and down, I can tell right away if the engineering and the calibration were done properly, because really quick shifting transmission using paddle shifter is very apparent when you're driving a little bit aggressively and you need to shift up and down quickly. From that regard, I would say this is definitely one of the best transmission because it's really, really smooth. But I also have to admit that Porsche 911's paddle shifter, which is a PDK, is perhaps the best in the world. That one does have a little bit faster feel than, let's say, compared to SL63. And the feel of the paddle shift in terms of the shifting up and down is a little bit better on the 911 as well. But having said that, the SL63's overall transmission shifting and the paddle shifter feel is one of the best in the world. It is definitely better than the LC500 transmission, which tends to have a little bit more of a relaxed feel, once again because that one is a bit more of a Grand Touring comfortable sports car versus a pure sports car like the Porsche 911. So that one has a slightly slower shifting up and down to accommodate a more comfortable feel. The next point is also one of those things that people don't talk about too much, but it's very important in a high-performing sports car, and that is the braking system. And you can argue all day exactly what kind of mechanism you should have in the braking system to make it really good, but to me, it just comes down to the feel. How good is the brake feel? What kind of feedback do you get when you step on the brake? How quickly can it stop the car? But is it also able to give you the right amount of comfort when you step on the brake so it's not too sensitive? So from that perspective, I would say this one has one of the best braking systems in the world, in the sense that if I step on the brake, it just comes to stop in a heartbeat. But at the same time, it is so good that it's a bit too grippy sometimes for daily driving, and I find myself constantly calibrating my foot a little bit to adjust to the right amount of a brake feel. So once again, I will have to admit that the 911's braking is a little bit better in terms of feel, But in terms of the capability of the braking, this one is one of the best. What about the Lexus LC 500? I think that one has a little bit softer feel once again, so it's not quite at the same caliber as the SL63 or the 911, but it does provide a little bit more of a comfortable feel and a more familiar feel for those people who are used to driving and owning a Lexus. So braking feel is a little bit difficult to define, but this is something that is very subjective. You have to drive it and feel it yourself and decide which of the brake feel the best for you. And then you can also look at the spec sheet from either the manufacturer or from other reviewers who's done a documented braking test, and obviously shorter the braking, the better. The last point I want to talk about is the drivetrain. And what I mean by that is whether the car is a front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, or all-wheel drive. Well, in the case of this SL63 and also many of the Porsche 911 models, it either comes as a standard or is available with all-wheel drive. And for us who live in the West Coast here in Canada, that is somewhat important if I want to drive that particular sports car day to day throughout the winter time, because rear-wheel drive cars are kind of useless in wintertime here, even though we don't get a huge amount of snow or slippery condition in Vancouver, but we get lots of rain. So this one is a little bit dependent on where you live and what your needs are. If you're only going to drive sports car in the summertime, or you're in a climate where there are no winter conditions, then I will always pick a rear-wheel drive vehicle compared to either all-wheel drive or front-wheel drive vehicle for a real sports car. But if you want to drive a sports car over the winter time and you do get some snow or it is a slippery conditions, then obviously I'm going to prefer all-wheel drive vehicle like this one here, and you can get it on the 911 as well. But you can't get it on the Lexus LC 500 because that one is a pure rear-wheel drive vehicle. At the end of the day though, I will never pick a front-wheel drive vehicle as a true sports car, maybe with the exception of a Honda Civic Type R, because that one has just amazing real fun to drive feel despite having front-wheel drive. So that is a bit of an exception to the rule, but other than that, I just wouldn't pick front-wheel drive car and define it as a real sports car, because it is just so difficult to achieve the right dynamics and the right feel with the power going to the front wheels. And also I might add that some all-wheel drive cars have a really good balance in the sense that even though they're all-wheel drive, because it's a rear wheel biased and more power and torque is going to the rear wheel, kind of feel like a rear wheel drive car. Perhaps that's the best combination, especially if you live in a colder climate, just because you have a full advantage of a full traction all-wheel drive that will give you the best amount of power hitting the road without losing the power, because you're not going to have a slippage in the back and you're not going to lose composure over a curvy road in a slippery condition. So those are some of the factors I talked about in terms of what defines a true sports car and what makes something so fun to drive. I hope you found this video helpful. From my perspective, which sports car would I pick for my daily driver? Well, that's a difficult question to answer depending on my needs. If I want to drive a car for a daily ride and it's only for the summertime and I don't have to worry about winter condition, I'm going to probably pick the Lexus LC 500 because it is the most comfortable, most grand touring type sports car, and it has that beautiful naturally aspirated V8 engine, and I really like the design of that vehicle. But if I want the ultimate all year round vehicle that has both performance and also comfort at the same time, well, this SL63 hits the mark because it's all-wheel drive. I can still enjoy the sun with a convertible top, but it's also just the right amount of balance between performance and comfort, and I can drive this all day, all year. It's just a great sports car. But it is a very expensive sports car, about the same price as a Porsche 911 Turbo and Turbo S, and therefore it's obviously not for everyone. Well, what about the Porsche 911 Turbo or just Porsche 911 in general? Well, that one does have the best sports car feel, and it's closest to my definition of a pure sports car. So if I have two cars, let's say one for normal daily drive and the other car just for having fun, and I don't have to always worry about winter conditions, for example, I think rear-wheel drive 911 is absolutely the best car to drive and best car to own, because it is just so fun to drive. And then if I have to drive that car all year round, including the winter condition, then 911 with all-wheel drive would fill the bill. Well, those are some of my dreams. I don't know which one will come true, but perhaps at some point I will be able to find a used Lexus LC 500. That'll be a dream come true because it's at least within the reach of my price range, whereas something like this one, the SL63 or 911 Turbo, it's just too much money for me. But if someone will buy it for me, obviously I'm going to take them. I hope you enjoyed my video, and if you haven't done so yet, would you give me a thumbs up, make some comments, and if you can subscribe, that would be truly appreciated. Until next video, I'm signing off for now. Thank you so much.